Hi, this is Simon Upstill and welcome to another tutorial for Apple Motion, and in this tutorial we'll be looking at this particle-based vortex effect. And as a bonus, I'll also show you the really interesting effect that I managed to create by accidentally inputting a crazy variable. So that's pretty wild and interesting, I think. So lots of fun stuff to look at, and let's make a start. So first of all, let's check up on our project setup. So we've got 1920 1080, 25 frames a second, and a duration of 20 seconds. So the first thing I'm going to do is come over to the library, just grab from the generators a color solid, and let's just make it black. So this can sit behind everything. And then I'm going to make a new group above that. So I want to make this group 3D. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down and select the circle tool, and holding down the Shift and Option key, drag out a circle. So I don't want an outline, I want a fill, and I actually want the fill color to be black. We won't see it for the time being, but we will shortly. So I want to come over and set the radius to 4000, reset the transform, set the X rotation to -90. So then to this circle, I'm going to add filters, stylize, add noise. I want to turn off auto animate. I want to select pink noise for the style and a mix value of 20. Now we can't see what I'm doing here just yet, and that's because we need to add a camera. So let's do that. So add the camera. I want to set that angle of view to 100 degrees. It's a nice dramatic wide angle lens, but let's first of all set its rotation. So X -15, and you can see we're looking down now onto this floor, and we've got that noise texture on it. And I just need to adjust its position. We'll go for a Y value of 250 and a Z value of 500. So then what we want to do is come back to that circle, and I'm going to add distortion twirl. And what I'm going to do with the twirl is to add a rate behavior to that twirl value. So add parameter behavior rate, and I'm going to set that rate to something like 5. And you can see that now we've kind of got this vortex effect around the center there. And the only other thing I want to do with this is I want to come back to my noise, and I want to turn on monochrome in order to kind of get rid of that multicolored effect. Don't panic if you don't see this later on. It's meant to be monochrome, and I forgot to turn on that switch as I was doing my original recording. So then what I want to do is to this group, I want to add a new circle. So let's select the circle tool, draw a new circle, and make sure to center it up. Make sure to set its X rotation to -90. So geometry, I want a radius of 775. And let's come over to style, turn on fill, turn off outline. Let's have a feather of 50. And for the fill mode, I want to select gradient. And let's just select from the gradient library. Let's select grayscale and open it up. And obviously we want a radial here. And I'm going to set the Y start to 0 and the Y end to -750. So then I'm going to click here on the color tab, or the color bar rather, to set a new tab there. And I'm just going to reverse the order of these by clicking on that top one there. And this one at the right here, I'm going to set that value all up to 100% white. The one on the left here, I'm going to set that value to 100% black. And then this one in the middle here, using the grayscale slider, let's set that value to 30% gray. And then let's click on its location here and set that location value to 99%. And then I'm going to grab this middle slider here and drag it out like that. So we've got something like this. So then to this circle, I want to add stylize, crystallize, and the defaults are fine. And you can see that it's just kind of breaking up the edges and also giving us a nice sort of boiling texture there, which is going to be good for our sort of emitter source. I also want to add filters, glow and neon. And here I want to set the outer glow value to 512. And then I'm just going to animate the opacity of this circle. So I'm going to come to 6 seconds on the timeline and keyframe its opacity there, come to the first frame and set that down to 0. So it's just going to increase in intensity as the particles start to emit. Now, looking at this, I realised I've entered a wrong number, and that's my feather here. It should have been -50, not positive 50. And you can see how much better that is now that we've got this sort of much finer circle around the outside. So I've renamed that background black group as black. That's the 2D group there. And this group with the circle and the floor in it, I've renamed floor. And there's only one other thing I want to do with this circle here, the kind of glowing circle. That's to come over to properties and lighting and turn off its lighting. So when we add a light, I want this to look like a light source and not be affected by the lighting. So let's finally come on to the fun part, which is the particles. So let's make a new group, object new group. And I'm going to come over to the library and I'm going to look for content. And down there in this search, I'm going to type in blur. And the one I'm looking for is called Blur 07. So I'm going to bring that into my group like that. And in fact, I can turn it off. So what we're going to do with this blur is we're going to make an emitter. So object make particles. So first of all, let's set the shape to circle and the arrangement to outline. Let's make sure to turn on 3D. I want a radius of 750. And I'm just going to scoot over to the properties and get it aligned on the x-axis. So that's an x rotation of -90. And coming back to the emitter, what we're going to do is we're going to set for now a birth rate of 300. We can increase that later on once we're happy with the result. So then I'm going to come down and set the life to 15. The speed I'm going to set to 0, but I'm going to add a little bit of speed randomness so the particles are not too uniform. Coming down, I'm going to set the angle randomness to 360, the spin randomness to 180, and I'm going to enable additive blend. Let's come down to the scale and set that to 30, and the scale randomness also to 30. And now what I'm also going to do here is, with that attached to emitter, I'm going to set that amount to 1%. And that's because I want to come over to properties and I want to very slightly twirl this around. So in order to do that, I'm going to add a rate behavior to the Y. So add parameter behavior rate, and I'm going to set that rate to 1%. And it's just going to very slightly sort of move it around along with the twirl that we've got on the floor. So let's come back to the emitter and we need to do some work on the cell. I'm going to set the color mode to from color range, pick from color range. And this immediately shows us another problem we need to address with this emitter, and that's that we need to set its blend mode to add. And that gets rid of all that horrible sort of grey fringing. So going back to that gradient, again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select grayscale from the menu where grayscale is there. So these are the built-in gradients that come with motion. So this is just going to give us a bit of color variation within the particles. Don't panic that my color version looks a little bit different to what you'll have. It really is not going to make any difference. And I was just playing around with some alternative values. And what I also need to do is I need to adjust its over life opacity. So I'm going to make a new tab on the top here, or rather two new tabs. That second one I've created there, we want to move it all the way to the end. So a location at 100%. This middle one here, let's set its location to 5%. And the first one, let's set that opacity down to 0. And the last one, set that opacity down to 0. So that over life they will fade off. And if we want them to fade off nearer their end of life, we can move that middle point. And looking at my notes, I realise I've given you a slightly wrong number here. This rate value for the Y rotation, let's risk going up to 5 degrees. And I think you can see what that's doing is it's following that rotation around a little bit more. 1 degree wasn't really enough. So now to the kind of magic bit where it all kind of starts to take shape. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a dummy object, and I'm going to just select a rectangle. And it really doesn't matter what it is. Literally I'm going to just draw a square like that. Nothing about this is important other than its position. And in fact, I'm going to duplicate it, right-click, duplicate, and duplicate it again. Right-click, duplicate, so I've got 3 instances. And you'll notice that I've renamed those low, mid, and high. I'm going to select them all, come over to Properties, and let's reset their transform. So they're all at dead center in 0. So the only one whose position I actually need to change is the one called high. And there I'm going to set its Y position to 1000. So then this is the key part. In order to kind of get these particles flocking around the way I want them to do, I'm going to be applying some oscillate behaviors to these 2 mid and high dummy objects. So the mid, I'm going to select its position, add parameter behavior, oscillate. I'm going to make sure that its properties transform position X and Z. And I'm going to set that amplitude to 750. And for the high, I'm going to do the same thing. So right-click, add parameter behavior, oscillate. Again, I want to make sure that its properties transform position X and Z. This time I'm going to set the amplitude to 50. And I'm going to change the phase so it's not in sync with the other one. So the phase is going to be 3. So now I've set up the positions and behaviors of those dummy objects that are going to control the flocking behavior of the particles. So I can turn those all off. We don't need to see them. And I can come back to my emitter. Now, the first thing I'm going to do with my emitter is to come to behaviors, and I'm going to add simulation gravity. And I don't want a gravity that pulls things down. I want a gravity that drags things up. So in order to do that, we're going to enter a negative value. So that's negative 20 for the acceleration. And you can see now that the particles are flying upwards. Now, we're not going to be able to see the rest of it unless I animate this camera. So I'm just move that camera up to the top there. And to animate it, I'm going to add basic motion throw. I'm going to make sure to switch to ramp to final value, open up the throw distance. I'm going to have a Y value of 1500 and a Z value of 1500. And you can see that kind of allows us to sort of zoom out away from the emitter. So I'm going to kind of park here around 12 seconds while we build the rest of it. So the next thing I want to add to this emitter is behaviors, simulations, and attracted to. And the first thing I want to attract to is my low. So I'm going to grab my low dummy and drag it into the source there. Now I want to turn off Y and I want to turn on Z. You can already see how this is sort of creating a kind of pretty weird effect with the particles. Obviously our strength is far too great, however, so I'm going to set that down to 5. We've now got this wine glass effect, but that's still not right. And I'm also going to increase that fall-off rate to 2. And I've called that attracted to low. And I'm going to add another one, so simulations attracted to. And this time I'm going to use my mid. And unfortunately, while I was turning those off, I turned off the oscillate behavior, so make sure those are turned back on again, because that's really what's going to do all the hard work. So let's come back to that new attracted to behavior. Again, I'm going to set the strength here to 5, and I don't want Y, but I do want Z. And I'm going to leave the fall-off rate where it is for the time being. And finally, we need to use the high dummy object. So behaviors, simulations, attracted to, and we'll use the high as the source. So this time I want quite a lot of strength, so I'm going to go for 25. And I want to include all three parameters, all three axes, I should say. And this is now giving us the effect that I want. And you can see we get that lovely kind of vortex swirl effect. At the top, it's going a little bit sort of crazy, and I quite like that. It's sort of escaping the orbit of the tornado, as it were. But what's good about this effect is that it's kind of organic, because we're allowing these different attractors to influence the particles in different ways. So I just wanted to give you a brief sort of theoretical explanation of why this flocking behavior actually works, or how it actually works. As we saw, we were using a gravity to drive the particles upwards, but we don't actually need to do that. So I'm actually going to turn that off. And I'm just going to show you what happens when we use an attractor. So I'm using this rectangle here as the attractor, and I've applied an attracted to behavior to the emitter, and I'm using X, Y, and Z. So let's just turn it on and see what happens. So the particles fly up and they get sucked into a point where that rectangle is, and then they carry on in the opposite direction. And if we zoom out, you'll see that the particles actually start flying back down towards the attractor object, that rectangle. And if we increase the strength, you'll see that they get driven down towards that dummy object even more forcibly. But no matter how fast they go, they will always get drawn back to that center point, that sort of black hole, as it were. Now, for our purposes, we want to try and find a way of avoiding them getting sucked towards that center point, and instead kind of flock around. So, and that's where the oscillate behavior comes in. So to this rectangle, I've applied an X and Z oscillate. And if we turn that on, you can immediately see the difference that makes. So the particles are now flocking around, being driven by the oscillate on the dummy object. So what I've done in our project is to set up a whole sequence of attractors so that I can guide the behavior of the overall flocking. So there are countless different ways in which we can finesse this by adjusting the different strengths of the attractors, the positions, the fall-off rate, and so on. Just experiment carefully. Don't go crazy with the numbers, because you very quickly get confused, but it's well worth trying. So that rate is also, if you remember, that's kind of giving us a little bit of an orbital effect with the particles at the bottom, because they're attached to the emitter. So then I think what we need to do is we need to add a light. So add object light. And as you see, that's kind of helpfully getting rid of some of that background that we don't want. So I'm going to set its intensity to 1500 and its fall off to 5%. And I'm going to set its Y position to 1000 and its Z position to 0. And you can see that gives us this nice little pool of light around the base, just like that. So finally, let's do a little bit of color correction. So the group with the particles in, I've called particles, and there's my group called floor. So above the particles group, I'm going to make a new group, and I'm going to drop the particles and the floor into that group. And to that group, I'm going to add color and color curves. And really, you can do anything you want with this. You can go blue, but I think I want to go with some green. So I'm going to just increase that green value like that. Probably a bit too much, but just a little bit like that, which I think is rather nice. So there is the effect more or less finished. Obviously, when you come to render it, you'll want to increase the number of particles. I recommend probably something like 750. So if I turn that up, my computer's starting to grind a little bit with these numbers, but you can see how much nicer that is. So the more particles you can throw at it, the prettier it's going to look. But obviously, the slower it's going to take you to render. So that's basically the project that I meant to show you, but what's even more interesting is what happens when you accidentally make a mistake, as I did when I was prepping this tutorial. So I'm just going to come into that floor group and I'm going to turn off that sort of background circle that's creating the floor, because that's confuses things a little bit. So what I did by mistake, when I was setting up this rate behavior for the emitter, I entered a crazy value down here. Instead of that 5 degrees, I entered a value of 50 degrees. And what that did was it started fairly normal. But then we got this amazing kind of swirl of particles. It's not going to keep up, I don't think. I'll cut to an actual render of this so you can see it properly. And because it's kind of swirling the emitter around in a really dramatic fashion around the y-axis, it's firing off these particles into kind of deep space, as it were. But the flocking behavior is still making it look really nice and organic. So there you go. I hope that's been interesting, and I hope you have fun experimenting with it. Thanks for watching, and see you again soon.